Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Last week I started working on the cabinets for my workbench. Now it's time to finish them up. Check it out. I've got both pieces of the cabinets all finished up, and I've got the drawer bodies and drawer slides installed throughout the whole thing. So next I need to put on some drawer fronts, and to do that I'm going to try a little bit of an experiment.
I'm going to use these rough sawn cherry boards to make the drawer fronts. These came out of a stack of lumber in my grandpa's basement that had been there since long before I was born. They clearly came off of a circular blade style sawmill, and I really like the curving sawtooth lines in them. So here's the experiment. I want to try and preserve the saw marks in the finished product, but I'm not sure how it's going to look when I'm done. I'm going to start by only doing one drawer from start to finish to make sure I like the look of it before I hack up all these great old boards. So after some careful measuring to make sure that I allocated enough to do all the drawers, I cut off one piece.
Now in order to mount this to the front of the drawer body, I'm going to have to flatten one side of it because there's a pretty nasty bow in the middle of it. Now I don't want to flatten both sides because then I'm going to lose my circular saw marks. Now the trick becomes, which side do I flatten? Well, I think I'm going to have the concave part be the front face of the drawer because it makes more sense to me that it would mate up to a above or below drawer curving that way, as opposed to if I had this forward, all of the drawers would be dished in the middle and stick out at the top and bottom of it. So I need to take this piece and stick it down to a sled and run it through my drum sander.
This is the widest board that I'll be using, and it won't quite fit through my planer. That's why I'm using the drum sander this time. It'll be slower, but I'll end up with the same result. I used one of the old cabinet doors from my dining room remodel to act as my flat sled. Then, I used shims to keep the workpiece from rocking around and used hot glue to temporarily lock it in place. It took many passes because the drum sander takes off much less material per pass than a planer can, but eventually I got the job done. I popped the board off the sled and tested it against my table to make sure it was flat. I squared one edge at the joiner, then used the table saw to rip it to final width. In order to save the saw marks but still have a smooth surface, I sanded the board lightly with 80, 120, then 220 grit paper. Next I used my small table saw sled to square off one end, then cut it to final length. I wiped down one coat of fast-drying polyurethane. This way, I could see what the finished drawer face would look like. When the rest of the faces get caught up, I can easily add another coat to this one.
Well, I let that coat of poly dry overnight, and I really like the results. I think we'll go ahead and cut up the rest of these boards and sort of match this to the rest of the drawer fronts. Now, I actually took this inside last night and showed it to my wife, and she thought it looked great. And then I told her what I was using it for, and she couldn't believe that I was wasting such a nice piece of wood on a shop project. And you know, this spent decades in my grandpa's basement just waiting for the right project. And I don't know if it was special to him, but that kind of makes it special to me, so I can't think of a better project than to be on a piece of shop furniture that I'm going to be working near every day and just kind of know that it came from him. So, we're going to cut some more of this up.
Now that I have my proof of concept, I cut the rest of the boards to rough length to start getting them caught up to the first one. I drew a straight reference line down one edge of each of the boards, then cut them on the bandsaw. This step serves two purposes. It makes the boards fit through my narrow planer, and it eliminates one live edge so they'll be easier to square on the joiner. Once again, I flattened each board, this time by running a sled through the planer, which was much faster. Then I squared the edges on the joiner. I ripped the face for the bottom drawer to width, then squared up one end, but left the board longer than it needed to be. I put a small spacer on my workbench to create some clearance, then set up the face against the cabinet to check the fit. It looks like I must have something a bit out of square, so I marked the corner that needs to be trimmed. Then using a shim between the board and the fence of my radial arm saw, I trimmed it at a slight angle. When I checked the fit against the side of the cabinet again, this time it was perfect. On the opposite side, I marked the board where it will need to be cut in order to match up exactly with the edge of the cabinet. Then I used a square to transfer that mark around to the front side where I'll be able to see it. This end is still a rough cut from the circular saw, so I squared it up to give me a good place to start, but left lots of space between this first cut and my mark. Then I checked that square end against the side of the cabinet and found that it was slightly askew, just like the other side was. So I marked the corner that needed to be trimmed and went back to the radial arm saw. At this point, it was just a matter of trimming the angle, checking the fit, then adjusting the shims and trying again until I had the board and the cabinet fitting just right. Once I knew what combination of shims it took to cut the perfect angle, I made one more cut right up to the line to get my final length. The remaining drawer faces got cut to size the same way. First I determined the width of the next face, then I cut it to size. I used a small stack of note cards between each face to make sure that each drawer had enough clearance to open and close without getting hung up on each other. Then I sanded all the boards using the same process and grit progression I did with the test board. Because of the deep gouges left by the sawmill, I also took this time to erase any pencil or chalk marks that the sander couldn't reach. I used compressed air to blow all the dust out of the deep saw marks, then walked away for a while to let the dust clear out of the air before I start putting finish on. I put the first coat of finish on fairly thick so that it could flow into all the nooks and crannies. I was a little surprised to see all the bubbles forming in the brushing process. I figured it couldn't be dust because I took care of that. Maybe it was the cheap brush I was using. Either way, they all popped as the poly dried, so it wasn't an issue. I followed the instructions on the can and lightly sanded with 220 grit before putting on the second coat. With the second coat of finish dry, it was time to mount the faces to the drawer bodies. Starting at the bottom, I made sure that the edges were lined up perfectly with the sides of the cabinet, then carefully clamped the face to the drawer so as to avoid scratching the new finish. Then, I could slide the door out to make it easier to access, and thanks to the help of my automated screw caddy, I ran some short screws through the drawer into the face from the back side to hold it in place. With the first one in place, it was time for some more repetition. Put the next face in place, clamp it down, run in the screws, and check the fit.
You full of goofballs or something there, goofball?
What are you doing?
Hello.
Hello.
The top drawer was a little different because there was no way to get clamps on it. To get around this, I put a bunch of hot glue on the drawer, then set the face in place and held it there while the glue hardened. Then I was able to carefully open the drawer and put a clamp on it to make sure it couldn't move while I drove in some screws. Next, it was time to install the handles. To do this, I just had to mark where exact center was on the drawers. Then, I could line up this jig I made with that mark and drill perfectly spaced out holes. This jig made it really easy to get all of the handles lined up in the center and spaced out vertically in every drawer. The screws that came with the handles were too short to go all the way through, so I just used a 1/2-inch Forstner bit to drill through the drawer body, which allowed the screws to stick through just enough. I also could have gone and bought some longer screws to solve this, but hardware stores aren't open at 10:30 at night, and I wasn't willing to wait. It's finally time to put the cabinets into the workbench. I started with the shorter one, and my brother helped me line it up and slide it into place underneath the flipping portion of the bench. It was a tight fit, but it came out exactly like I wanted. We slid the main cabinet into the bench, then put in all the drawers so we could fine-tune its position and make sure that everything had enough clearance to open and close freely. With everything working smoothly, I fastened the cabinet body to the bench by running screws through the bottom and through the sides into the legs. For one last finishing touch, I had taken a section from one of the live edge cutoffs and sanded and finished it alongside all the drawer faces. Then I used CA glue to hold it to the side of the cabinet while I checked for drawer clearance. With everything working nicely, I added a few brad nails for good measure. I think this makes a nice transition piece going from the rougher drawer faces to the smooth cabinet wall.
Well guys, that about wraps this up. I did want to point out a few design choices that I made along the way. For example, the height of this drawer was determined by the height of the tools that I have mounted to the flipping stations. So if you didn't have something quite so tall as my planer or my spindle stander on the other side, you could get away with making these drawers taller or even making a second drawer. But for my cases, they had to be this dimension. Now another decision I made is I didn't quite make this cabinet quite as tall as I could have. There's a couple more inches in there before it would run into the underside of the hardware for that front vise. And the reason I did this is I wanted to have a space for my sharpening station, which is a big granite slab that has a bunch of sandpaper on it for sharpening different things. Now one of the biggest design decisions I made was due to the fact that I keep my table saw butted right up against the left side of this workbench. Because of that, I don't really have access to this left side. And that's why I have the drawers coming out the front side and out the right side. Now if you wanted to build one of these yourself, it'd be really easy to adjust the plans and have all the drawers out the front or the drawers out both the left and right side. It's really modular that way. Now if you want to build one yourself, I've got plans for it on my website and there's a link to that in the description. And that's about all I have to say today, so thanks for checking it out, and we'll see you next time.